patita no,
Morning. It's plugged. Yeah, there's a bag there. Anthony did that. What? Somebody took it out? That's weird. Who would have taken that out? Who would have been that ambitious to take that out? I'm surprised. That's really weird. Maybe. Today we're honoring the disappearance day of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. We're going to, the disappearance day, we're going to sing Saparshara Gaura Viraha Vilap. Ye anilo premadana karuna prachur. It's the very last page. He no Prabhu Kotagela Acharya Thakur Kotagela Acharya Thakur Kahamora Swaruprupa Kahasanatan Kahadasa Raghunatha Patita Pava Kahamora Bhattadyuga Kahakaviraj Ekakale Kotagila Gauranataraj Pasane Kutibo Mata Anale Pashibo Goranga Gunyara Nidhi Kotagile Pavo Se Sabha Sangira Sange Ye Koilo Vilash Se sangana paya kande narotamadas. Ye anilo prema dana karuna prachur. Jaya Vaishnav Thakur, Jaya Vaishnav Thakur, Jaya Vaishnav Thakur, Jaya Vaishnav Thakur. Jaya Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Jaya Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. He who brought the treasure of divine love and who was filled with compassion and mercy, where has such a personality as Srinivas Acharya gone? Where are my Sarup Damodar and Rupa Goswami? Where is Sanatana? Where is Raghunath Das, the savior of the fallen? Where are my Raghunath Bhatta and Gopala Bhatta? And where is Krishna Das Kaviraj? Where did Lord Gauranga, the great dancer, suddenly go? I will smash my head against the rock and enter into the fire. Where will I find Lord Gauranga, the reservoir of all wonderful qualities? Being unable to obtain the association of Lord Gauranga, accompanied by all these devotees in whose association he performed his pastimes, Narottama Das simply weeps. Om Jnanatinamanda Shagananjana Shalakaya Chakshuramiddhina Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivinoda Swami Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharini Vishesha Sunapari Pashita Vishatarine Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimati Vir Krishna Das Goswami Namane Namaha Sanikashaya Prabhupada Suki Dasuki Inuvadi name. Today, I'm meditating quite a lot on this time of year because actually Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's disappearance was on December 31st and January 1st actually in 1936. So toward the end of the year, we meditate on Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur as actually the foremost influence of bringing Krishna consciousness to the West, actually. We hear so much about our dear beloved Srila Prabhupada and how he was able to surmount great obstacles to come to the West to bring the message of Lord Chaitanya. But that was with great impetus and a lot of angst on carrying out the mission of his Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So I actually wanted to read a little bit, just as Prabhu was advising not to speak so much about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's early days. Probably many of you all have heard about his upbringing. He was the son of another great guru in our parampara, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and who had prayed for a ray of Vishnu. And then Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur appeared. And he had a very, very targeted upbringing, I'll say. He was able to use all of his intelligence and will to learn so much about so many aspects of Vedanta and even many sort of seemingly mundane subject matter like astrology and astronomy. He was extremely erudite and had memorized the Bhagavad Gita by the time he was 8. I mean, he was just an extremely extraordinary personality growing up. And fast forward to 1922, when the Thakur was not that old, probably around my age, 50. And he was there in India preaching, and at some point he caught the notice of a friend of Srila Prabhupada. So I'm going to read a little bit from the Lilamrita and discuss some of what had happened and how the transfer of the impetus to preach, you can see practically how it came to pass. Abai's friend, Naranandra Nath Mullik, was insistent. Abai Charande, we know Abai Charande is Srila Prabhupada. Abai's friend Narendra Nath Mullik was insistent. He wanted Abai to see a sadhu from Mayapur. Naren and some of his friends had already met the sadhu at his nearby ashram on Ultadanga Junction Road and now wanted Abai's opinion. Everyone within their circle of friends considered Abai the leader, so if Naren could tell the others that Abai had high regard for the sadhu, then that would confirm their own estimations. Abai was reluctant to go, but Naren pressed him. They stood talking amidst the passers-by on the crowded early evening street. Naren put his hand firmly around his friend's arm, trying to drag him forward, while Abai smiled, but stubbornly pulled the other way. Naren argued that since they were only a few blocks away, they should at least pay a short visit. Abai laughed and asked to be excused. People could see the two young men were friends, but it was a curious sight, the handsome young man dressed in white khadi kurta and dhoti being pulled along by his friend. Naren explained that the sadhu, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, was a Vaishnava and a great devotee of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. One of his disciples, a sannyasi, had visited the Mullik house and had invited them to meet Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. A few of the Mulliks had gone to see him and had been very much impressed. So at the time, Bhaktisiddhanta was executing his mission, which was to empower disciples. He had some sannyasi disciples, and he himself had taken sannyas after his Guru Maharaj had left the planet, so he could fully devote his time and energy to preach the cult of Lord Chaitanya. So there was a lot of help in that regard. He was empowering many people, just like our Prabhupada did when he was on the planet. He empowered many people to go to other countries, to China and Russia and so many places to preach Krishna consciousness. And in the same way, before him, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had empowered many to fan out to many places along the countryside, although at that point he hadn't really branched out beyond India. Abai remained skeptical. "Oh no, I know all these sadhus," he said. "I'm not going." Abai had seen many sadhus in his childhood. Every day his father had entertained at least 3 or 4 in his home. Some of them were no more than beggars, and some even smoked ganja. His father had been very liberal in allowing anyone who wore the saffron robes of a sannyasi to come. But did it mean that a man was no more than a beggar or ganja smoker? He had to be considered saintly just because he dressed as a sannyasi or was collecting funds in the name of building a monastery or could influence people with his speech? No. By and large, they were a disappointing lot. Abai had even seen a man in his neighborhood who was a beggar by occupation. In the morning, when others dressed in their work clothes and went to their jobs, this man would put on a saffron cloth and go out to beg, and in this way earned his livelihood. So he was, not really that keen on meeting this personality, even though his friend was dragging him and all the other friends had seen him and We're very excited to have Abai, who again was the leader and was brought up in a very nice Vaishnava home and had very, very good moral compass. He knew exactly what a Vaishnava should be like, how they should conduct themselves, etc. Naran argued that he felt that this particular sadhu was a very learned scholar and Abai should at least meet him and judge for himself. Abai wished that Naran would not behave this way, but finally he could no longer refuse his friend. Together, they walked past the Parshnath Jain temple to Uttadanga with its sign, Bhakti Vinod Asana, announcing it to be the quarters of the Gaudiya Madh. When they inquired at the door, a young man recognized Mr. Mullik. Naran had previously given a donation and immediately escorted them up to the roof of the second floor and into the presence of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, who was sitting and enjoying the early evening atmosphere with a few disciples and guests. Sitting with his back very straight, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur appeared tall. He was slender, his arms were long, and his complexion was fair and golden. He wore round bifocals with simple frames. His nose was very sharp, his forehead broad, and his expression was very scholarly, yet not at all timid. The vertical markings of Vaishnava tilak on his forehead were familiar to Abai, as were the simple sannyas robes that draped over his right shoulder, leaving the other shoulder and half his chest bare. He wore tulsi neck beads, and the clay Vaishnava markings of tilak were visible at his throat, shoulder, and upper arms. A clean white brahminical thread was looped around his neck and draped across his chest. Abai and Naran, having both been raised in Vaishnava families, immediately offered prostrated obeisances at the sight of the revered sannyasi. So it sounded like Abai Charande had a little bit of a change of heart upon seeing this effulgent person. While the two young men were still rising and preparing to sit, before any preliminary formalities of conversation had even begun, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta immediately said to them, "You are educated young men. Why don't you preach Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's message throughout the whole world?" Abai could hardly believe what he had just heard. They had not even exchanged views, yet this sadhu was telling them what they should do. Back in those days, if there was differing religious doctrines or, differing parties wanted to understand another person's position on the religious, beliefs, they had what was called samvat, which was very mannerly discourse. They actually were able to discuss in a gentlemanly way each other's points of view to sort of churn out the truth, as it were. So they hadn't even spoken to him at all. They just appeared, and he said this to them. They had not even exchanged views, yet sitting face to face with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Abai was gathering his wits and trying to gain a comprehensible impression. But this person had already told them to become preachers and go all over the world. Abai was just a young man at this point. He wasn't thinking anything about that, and he was actually still sort of beholden to Gandhi's movement. Abai was immediately impressed, but he wasn't going to drop his intelligent skepticism. After all, there were assumptions what the sadhu had said. Abai had already announced himself by his dress to be a follower of Gandhi, and he felt the impulse to raise an argument. Yet as he continued to listen to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta speak, he also began to feel won over by the sadhu's strength of conviction. He could sense that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta didn't care for anything but Lord Chaitanya, and that this was what made him great. This was why followers had gathered around him, and why Abai himself felt drawn, inspired, and humbled, and wanted to hear more. But he felt obliged to make an argument, to test the truth. Drawn irresistibly into discussion, Abai spoke up in answer to the words Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had so tersely spoken in the first seconds of their meeting. "Who will hear your Chaitanya's message?" Abai queried. "We are a dependent country. First, India must become independent. How can we spread Indian culture if we are under British rule?" And he didn't ask, proudly. He just wanted to honestly know at that point, because although he was a Vaishnava, he still wasn't over that hump of understanding the greater sort of purpose in the world, it seems. If he were to take the sadhu's remark to them as a serious one, and there was nothing in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's demeanor to indicate that he had not been serious, Abai felt compelled to question how he could propose such a thing while India was still dependent. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta replied in a quiet, deep voice that Krishna consciousness didn't have to wait for a change in Indian politics, nor was it dependent on who ruled. Krishna consciousness was so important, so exclusively important, that it could not wait. Abai was struck by his boldness. How could he say such a thing? The whole world of India beyond this little Uttadanga rooftop was in turmoil. This was during the war. This was when this is when bombs were being dropped around. This was when there was an occupation by the British, and really, at that point, the Indian peoples were kind of enslaved in a lot of ways. They were enslaved in textile factories. They were enslaved in tea factories. They were oppressed. They were oppressed, and if they showed any resistance, they would be, maybe killed or tortured or worse, or taken away. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said, whether one power or another ruled was a temporary situation, but the eternal reality is Krishna consciousness, and the real self is the spirit soul. No man-made political system, therefore, could actually help humanity. This was the verdict of the Vedic scriptures and the line of spiritual masters. As Abai listened attentively to the arguments of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he recalled a Bengali poet who had written that even less advanced civilizations, like China and Japan, were independent, and yet India labored under political oppression. So he was a little bit torn, because that was a hard pill to swallow. He had sort of grown up in those times, and that's kind of the world he knew then. He hadn't heard the absolute truth up until this point of meeting his spiritual master. And because he had been raised a Vaishnava, he could appreciate what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was saying. Abai had already concluded that this was certainly not just another questionable sadhu, and he did perceive the truth in what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said. The sadhu wasn't concocting his own philosophy, and he wasn't simply proud or belligerent, even though he spoke in a way that kicked out practically every other philosophy. He was speaking the internal teachings of the Vedic literature and the sages, and Abai loved to hear it. He felt himself defeated, but he liked it. He suddenly realized that he had never before been defeated. But this defeat was a loss. It was not a loss. It was an immense gain. Srila Prabhupada says, I was from a Vaishnava family, so I could appreciate what he was speaking. Of course, he was speaking to everyone, but he found something in me, and I was convinced about his argument and mode of presentation. I was so much struck with wonder. I could understand. Here is the proper person who can give a real religious idea. So when they walked out, his friend turned to him and said, so Abai, what was your impression? What did you think of him? He's wonderful, replied Abai. The message of Lord Chaitanya is in the hands of a very expert person, Srila Prabhupada. I accepted him as my spiritual master immediately, not officially, but in my heart. I was thinking that I had met a very nice, saintly person. So then, Srila Prabhupada began associating a little bit more with the devotees of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, because at that point he had been turned on. The Thakur had turned him on to this mission, which was burning inside, and Abai Charande didn't really know quite what to make of it, because he was headed into family life. You know, he was wearing white. He was wearing the garb of a grihasta, and he had a marriage that had been arranged. His wife was named Radharani, and he started getting into business. So he began his pharmacy business, and he was getting more into family life and more into his business and having children and like that. So at some point, several years later, you know, they had moved to Allahabad, Abai and his wife and children, for him to fully take on his pharmacy business. He traveled around, and he actually, several years later, also made it to Vrindavan and was able to see that. And he would frequent the Gaudiya Math in Calcutta. But he didn't have the darshan of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur for another 10 years, actually. You know, he was just sort of laboring away in the Grihastha ashram, raising children, providing for his family, doing all the things that were expected. But, you know, deep inside, he was still thinking about those words and the extremely impactful impression that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had made on him. So in October of 1932, which was about 10 years later, he led a group of hundreds of disciples and pilgrims on a month-long parikram of the sacred places of Vrindavan. That was during Kartik. And Abai heard about it. It was in the journal that he published at the time, The Harmonist, and also he heard from the members who were favorable to Abai because he kept coming around. He was, you know, giving donation, and he was, you know, making his presence known. He was a very stable, pleasant person who would frequent the mat there. So he took the time out, and he was able to travel there. Srila Prabhupada said, I was not initiated at the time of the parikram, but I had very good admiration for these Gaudiya Math people. They were very kind to me, so I thought, what are these people doing in this parikram? Let me go. So I met them at Kashi. So they were traveling, and it was quite a massive pilgrimage. Many, probably, it doesn't really say how many, but it kind of indicates that maybe hundreds of people were on this parikram, because he had quite a following at this point. Srila Prabhupada. So I met them in Kashi, and Keshava Maharaj was informing that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta is going to Mathura tomorrow morning, and he will speak Hari Katha this evening. Anyone who wants to may remain, or otherwise they may go to see Sheshashayi Vishnu. That was a deity that was in Mathura. So at the time, I think only 10 or 12 men remained. Sridhar Maharaj was one of them, and I thought it wise. What can I see at this Sheshashashi? Let me hear what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati will speak. Let me hear. So he sat and he listened. He had been speaking regularly about Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojana. An hour went by, 2 hours. The already small gathering in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's room gradually thinned. A few sannyasis left, excusing themselves to tend to duties connected with the parikram. Only a few intimate leaders remained. Abai was the only outsider. Of course, he was a devotee, not an outsider, but in the sense that he was not a sannyasi, was not handling any duties, was not even initiated, and was not traveling with the parikram, but had only joined for a day. In that sense, he was an outsider. The philosophy Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was speaking, however, was democratically open to whoever would give an ardent hearing, and that Abai was doing. He was listening with wonder. Sometimes he would not even understand something, but he would go on listening intently, submissively, his intelligence drinking in the words. Later on, somewhere in the little book, this little portion of the book, Prabhupada said that many times he couldn't even understand what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was speaking, but he would listen anyway because, his intelligence or his, it would go in and it would be assimilated later, I can imagine. And how masterfully he spoke, and with utter conviction and boldness, he felt Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati revealing to him the direct vision of the spiritual world, just as a person reveals something by opening a door or pushing aside a curtain. And that's what the spiritual master does. Many times we hear from the spiritual master, and maybe many years later we don't understand why he said what he said at the time, but then we can understand, okay, that's why he said this. Now I understand. And it takes that purity of heart and the of consciousness to be able to understand. So he sat and listened. He wanted only to hear more. As Srila Bhaktisiddhanta made his exit at that point, Abai bowed, offered his obeisances, and left the intimate circle of sannyasis in the row of tents, his mind surcharged with the words of his spiritual master. Now their relationship seemed more tangible. He still treasured his original impression of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, the saintly person who had spoken to him on the rooftop. But tonight, that single impression that had sustained him for years in Allahabad had been enriched and filled with new life. That was 10 years later. His spiritual master and the impression of his words were as much a reality as the stars in the sky and the moon over Vrindavan. That impression of hearing from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was filling him with its reality, and all other reality was forming itself around the absolute reality of Srila Gurudev, just as all the planets circle around the sun. A little more than a month later, so it took him 10 years to see, but then a little more than a month later, Abai was again anticipating an imminent meeting with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and this time he was coming to his location at Allahabad. He was traveling around. He would be coming on November 21st to preside over the ceremony for the laying of a cornerstone of a new mat in Allahabad. At home, when Abai learned that there would be an initiation ceremony, he asked if he could be initiated. Atulananda, the mat's president, assured Abai that he would introduce him to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. So he didn't even have a formal meeting with him yet, but he, in his heart, took him in as his guru because his words were so profound. At home, Abai discussed his initiation plans with his wife. She had no objection, but she did not want to take initiation herself. But for Abai, that was not enough. Although he would not force his wife, he knew that he must be initiated by a pure devotee. So he was readying himself for that, taking that step. And by taking initiation from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he would be linked with Krishna. He had taken a lot of times in families, especially Vaishnava families, they have a kind of a ritualistic initiation when they're young, about the time that they hit puberty, and they receive a mantra and sacred thread and things like that. But it's not something that links them to the parampara. So he was ready to be, hooked up to the Guru parampara and start his work in Krishna consciousness, as it were, because that initiation is the step where you're taking up the mission of the spiritual master. You're taking that as your life and soul, and you mold, just like was just stated here, you mold your life in such a way to execute that mission, no matter what. That's actually That's actually the point of initiation, so you can take up that mission. Abai felt that he had already accepted Srila Bhaktisiddhanta as the spiritual master, and that from their very first meeting, he had already received his orders, because he told him the very first thing out of his mouth was go and preach. Now, if Srila Bhaktisiddhanta would accept him as his disciple, the relationship would be confirmed. So that's another thing. Another point is when you take a spiritual master in your heart, the spiritual master also must accept you as someone that he can guide as his disciple. So it's a mutual relationship, because it's not just for this lifetime, it's for the following lifetimes. On the day of the ceremony, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati met with his disciples, and while he was speaking Harikatha and taking questions, Atulananda Brahmachari took the opportunity to present several devotees, Abai amongst them, as candidates for initiation. The Allahabad devotees were proud of Mr. Day, who regularly attended the math in the evening and led bhajans, listening to the teachings and spoke them himself, and often brought respectable guests. He had contributed money and had induced his business colleagues also to do so. With folded palms, Abai looked up humbly at his spiritual master. He and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta were now face to face, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta recognized him and was visibly pleased to see him. He already knew him. Yes, he said, exchanging looks with Abai, he likes to hear. He does not go away. I have marked him. I will accept him as my disciple. At that moment, and as the words became impressed into his being, Abai was in ecstasy. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of everything that we have here right now. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he did open quite a few temples as he could at the time with his resources and the disciples that would go out and, test new waters in different lands. And there was a center in London, there was a center in Germany, and there was a couple of temples in India, of course. But up to that point, there was no one successful in preaching abroad, to preaching the mission of Lord Chaitanya anywhere outside of a small radius, a relatively small radius, because even the centers in London and Germany were, it was not really very well managed, and they weren't doing very much as far as preaching work goes. So in the initiation, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta called for Abai to come forward and receive the Harinam initiation by accepting his beads. After offering prostrated obeisances, Abai extended his right hand and accepted the strand of japa beads from the hand of his spiritual master. At the same time, he also received the sacred Brahminical thread, signifying second initiation. Usually, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta gave the first initiation, Harinam, and only after some time when he was satisfied with the progress of the disciple would he give the second initiation. But he offered Abai both initiations at the same time. Now Abai was a full-fledged disciple, a Brahmana, who could perform sacrifices such as this fire yajna for initiation. He could worship the deity in the temple and would be expected to discourse widely. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta added Aravinda, lotus, to his name. Now he was Abai Charananavinda. So at that point, Srila Prabhupada said, my wife was a devotee of Krishna, but she had some other idea. Her idea was just to worship the deity at home and live peacefully. My idea was preaching. So that is how it all began. And it's pretty remarkable that 10 years later, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur recognized Prabhupada from the first time, And then the next time, when Prabhupada had this invitation or impetus to go see Aditi in Mathura, and he was touring in Vrindavan, and the mass of people went, but he decided to just stay back and hear. Just hear submissively. And Prabhupada talks about this so many times to all of his disciples and all of us. Just all you have to do is simply hear from the spiritual master and then act upon it, of course. But that infusion of spiritual energy that came from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur to Srila Prabhupada at that time, on those two occasions, he got very little association with his guru. You know, many of us are very, very spoiled. We have constant association, and we, you know, now in the age of the internet and recordings and things, we can hear a lecture many times, or we can miss a lecture and go back to hear it, or we can hear something from 10 years ago, but that wasn't the case then. So Srila Prabhupada, who had that, you know, obviously, being Srila Prabhupada, who's a Shaktivesh avatar, he had that seed of desire, and he already knew what his mission was. From the very first second he met his guru, he knew his mission was to go out and preach the message of Lord Chaitanya far and wide, in all corners of the planet. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur only had a limitation of, you know, resources and time. He left the planet when he was relatively young in 1936. He wasn't, you know, he wasn't very old. And actually, from previously studying there's a wonderful book called the Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Vaibhava, written by Bhakti-Vikas Swami. It's a 3-part volume. And we can understand from reading that whole, more of an in-depth character study of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, that the point that the preaching became more of a, you know, kind of a dog and pony show. You know, they had went from Ultadanga Junction Road, very small rented place. They, you know, money comes when there's service of the Lord, you know, money comes. It doesn't really have to be asked for, it just flows in. And then a new, very grand marble temple was built called Bagh Bazar. And immediately upon it being built, everyone in the assembly, not Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, but all of his disciples and like that, not all, but some, were immediately taking ownership of the rooms of the Bagh Bazar, and they were forgetting their purpose, because now that they had some seemingly comfortable surrounding, they had like a place, they had some opulence, they didn't really care so much to go out and do the hardcore preaching that was being done early on. And it kind of seems like that was the point that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur kind of, you know, became disgusted with that, you know, with that particular mentality, to not go out, to not share Krishna, to want to just sit in a room. And he told Srila Prabhupada later on, when that temple came up and Srila Prabhupada visited him for the very last time on the banks of the Radha Kund, he said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, this temple's, it's an albatross. Better we print books to spread Krishna consciousness, to preach. Better we print books. I'd tear the marble off the walls and cash it in so I could print books if there's that opportunity. So he drove that point home to Srila Prabhupada, really more than anybody else, more than any of his other disciples. All of his other disciples were kind of not really ready to take up that extremely difficult mission. So there's so much more that can be talked about with regard to Saraswati Thakur, and he's definitely someone that we should study and read, because he's a perfect example. He's a ray of Vishnu, actually, and he's the inspiration for our dear Srila Prabhupada's bringing Krishna consciousness to us, to me. So I'm extremely grateful, and it's a glorious day when we remember these exalted personalities. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj Ki Jai.
Go Andam Buddhi Vardhanam Pratipanam Brunamritaswa Sarvatmasnapanam Paramvijayate Sri Krishna Sankirtanam Nam Namakari Bahuda Nija Sarva Shakti Tatrapitani Amita Smarane Nakala Etad Vrishita Vakripa Bhagavan Mamapi Durdaiva Midrishami Hajjanina Nuraga Trinada Pisunichena Tarora Pisuhishuna Amani Namana Dana Kirtaniya Sadari Nadanam Najanam Nasundarim Kavitam Vajagadishakamaye Mama Janmani Janmani Ishvare Bhavatad Bhakti Rohaitaki Twai Ainanda Tanuja Kinkaram Patitam Mam Vishame Bhavam Buddha Kripayata Vabada Pankaja Stita Duli Sajivachintaya Nayanam Gladashu Daraya Varanam Gad Gadradaya Gira Pulakarnishitam Vapukada Tavanama Grahane Bhavishati Yugayatam Namishena Chakshusha Pravashayatam Shunayatam Jagat Sarvam Govindam Virahename Ashlisha-vapadam ratam-manastumam adarshanam marma-hatakarotuva yatatata vidadatulam-pato mat-prananatastu saivanapara. Victory to the Sri Krishna Sankirtan, which cleanses